This story takes place during my time in the Army, stationed overseas in a desolate area that I'll leave unnamed for good reason. It happened during a peacekeeping mission, but it was far from peaceful. I'd been there a little over a year when the event took place, and it was something I'll never forget, no matter how much I wish I could. When I first arrived, the base seemed like any other, dull, routine, and boring. You know the kind of place where you kill time with your fellow soldiers, swapping stories to fill the gaps of silence. But it didn't take long before the rumors started. Every base has its share of ghost stories, but this one was different. There were whispers about something lurking in the trenches just outside the perimeter. Some said it was the ghost of a soldier who never came back from a recon mission. Others claimed it was a manifestation of the land itself, angry and ancient. I never believed any of it, until that night. It was about 3 a.m, and I was out on guard duty with Private Collins. The air was thick with fog, making it impossible to see much beyond a few feet. The trench system we patrolled had been dug years before, long and winding like a labyrinth, intended for strategic cover during combat. But tonight it felt more like a graveyard. The cold seemed to cling to my bones, and every sound, every rustle of wind, every scrape of metal, felt like it was watching me, waiting for something. We'd done this 100 times before, and it was usually uneventful. But that night felt different. There was an oppressive weight in the air that made everything seem heavier. Even Collins, who usually wouldn't shut up about his hometown, was unusually quiet. His face pale, eyes scanning the dark corners of the trench like he expected something to leap out at him. We were making our final round when I saw it. At first it was just a flicker, a shadow that didn't belong, lingering at the edge of my vision. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I flicked on my flashlight and pointed it toward where I thought I saw the movement. But the beam of light was swallowed by the fog, illuminating nothing but the thick mist swirling like smoke. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Collins, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, his eyes wide and fearful. "Yeah, something's there." We both stood frozen, staring into the abyss, waiting for the shadow to return. For a few long moments, there was nothing but the eerie silence of the night. Then we heard it. A sound like heavy breathing, but distorted, almost like a growl. It was coming from deep within the trench, from a section that hadn't been used for months, sealed off after it collapsed during a storm. No one had been in there for ages, and there was no way anything should have been moving down there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the sound grew louder, closer. Collins and I exchanged a glance, both of us terrified, neither of us willing to admit it. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, gripping my rifle tightly. "We need to check it out." My voice was barely a whisper, as though I was afraid the thing, whatever it was, would hear me. Collins reluctantly followed, his flashlight beam jittering as his hand shook. As we made our way deeper into the trench, the air grew colder. The fog thickened, making it almost impossible to see. But then, through the mist, we saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still at the far end of the trench, silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the clouds. At first, I thought it was just another soldier, maybe someone pulling a prank. But then I realized something was horribly wrong. The figure was too tall, its limbs too long, stretched in ways that weren't natural. And its face was obscured by shadow, but the eyes, they glowed a sickly yellow, staring right at us, unblinking. I could feel its gaze pierce through me, like it was looking into my very soul. I don't remember who moved first, but within seconds, we were running, sprinting through the trench, not daring to look back. The thing never made a sound, but I could feel it following us, close behind. Its presence was heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every step felt slower, every corner harder to turn. We finally reached the ladder that led out of the trench and scrambled up, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests. Once we were out, We ran straight for the barracks, not stopping until we were safely inside, slamming the door shut behind us. We didn't talk about it after that. Not really. No one would believe us if we tried to explain what happened. But every night I could feel it out there, watching, waiting, the thing in the trench, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. Soldiers started avoiding that part of the base. We all did, as much as we could. And though no one ever said it out loud, we all knew the stories were true. Years later, I learned something that made everything worse. I was talking to an old friend who had been stationed at the base long before I ever arrived. He told me about a soldier who had gone missing during a recon mission years ago in that same trench. They never found his body. The official report said he'd fallen into a ravine, but some said he was still out there wandering the trench, lost and forgotten. That's when I realized what we saw that night wasn't just a ghost. It was something more, something ancient, trapped in the earth, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter its domain. I never went back to that base, and I've never told anyone else this story. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the air is still and the world is quiet, I can hear it. The sound of that heavy breathing growing closer, reminding me that some things are better left buried. This story takes place during my deployment in a remote desert region, deep within a war zone. It was one of those outposts that felt forgotten by the world, baking under the relentless sun by day and frozen by the chilling winds at night. I had been stationed there for about 6 months when the incident happened. I still don't know how I made it through that night, and it's something I wish I could erase from my memory. When I first arrived, everything seemed standard. Dusty barracks, long patrols, and a constant sense of waiting for something to go wrong. The kind of place where you quickly learn to shut your mind off, passing the time with card games and idle conversations. But soon after, the rumors started. Every soldier who had been there for a while warned the new guys about the old bunker on the edge of the base. Supposedly, it had been abandoned after a failed mission years ago. The story went that the squad stationed there had disappeared without a trace. Some said they were ambushed. Others believed something far worse happened in that bunker. I didn't pay much attention to the tales. Soldiers swapped stories to kill time and keep the fear at bay. But after what I saw, I should have listened. It was just after 2 in the morning, and I was on night watch with Private Harris. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, as if even the desert itself was holding its breath. The bunker we were assigned to patrol had been sealed off for years, crumbling, forgotten. Our orders were clear: maintain a perimeter, ensure no intruders. Simple enough. But that night, something about the silence felt suffocating, like the world had emptied itself of sound. We were making our usual rounds when I saw it. A flicker, barely visible, just outside the beam of my flashlight. I stopped in my tracks, heart racing in my chest. "Did you see that?" I whispered to Harris, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his eyes wide with the same fear I was trying to hide. "Yeah, there's something there." At first I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, maybe the wind kicking up dust. But then we both heard it. A deep, low growl, like an animal, but twisted, wrong. It came from inside the bunker. But that couldn't be possible. No one had been in there for years. The place was completely sealed, or so I had thought. Against every instinct in my body, I moved closer. The old rusted door stood ajar, barely hanging on its hinges. That door should have been locked. I turned to Harris, who shook his head, but neither of us spoke. We both knew there was no turning back now. Slowly we stepped inside, rifles raised, flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. The interior was cold, unnaturally so for a desert night. The air felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The bunker had been left in disrepair, the walls covered in graffiti and sand. But as we moved deeper, the silence returned, oppressive, absolute. And then we saw it. A figure, crouched in the far corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a squatter or another soldier who had gotten lost. But as the beam of my flashlight landed on it, I realized something was terribly wrong. The figure was too still, too rigid, and its eyes glowed a dull, sickly green in the darkness, unblinking, staring right at us. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, but every instinct screamed at me to get out. Harris was frozen beside me, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Without thinking, I took a step closer. The figure didn't move, but I could hear something, a low, gurgling noise like someone trying to breathe through water. My flashlight flickered, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The figure's head turned slowly, unnaturally, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice trembling. Harris didn't argue. We backed away slowly, trying to keep our eyes on the figure, but just as we reached the entrance, the growl came again, this time louder, more defined. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from beneath us. Without warning, the ground beneath our feet seemed to vibrate, like something was moving through the earth. We bolted. Neither of us said a word as we sprinted out of the bunker and into the open desert air. The bunker door slammed shut behind us with a loud metallic clang that echoed in the stillness. We didn't stop running until we reached the barracks, our hearts pounding in our chests, lungs burning from the cold air. Inside, we collapsed onto the floor, staring at each other in disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. We never spoke about that night again, at least not to anyone outside of the base, but the other soldiers noticed. Word spread quickly, and soon, no one went near that bunker. It became an unwritten rule: avoid it at all costs. Years later, long after I had left the military, I heard from a former comrade that the bunker had been sealed off permanently. They claimed it was due to structural instability, but I knew better. That place, whatever was in there, it wasn't natural. It was old, something that didn't belong in our world, something that was never meant to be disturbed. I still think about that night. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of my home, I can almost hear that low, guttural growl echoing in the back of my mind. And I wonder, if we hadn't run, would we have ever made it out? Or would we have disappeared, just like the soldiers before us? There are some places in the world that should remain forgotten. Some things are better left in the dark, buried beneath time and memory. The bunker was one of those places, a place that should have been left alone, a reminder that curiosity can lead us to doors that should never be opened. This story took place when I was stationed at a communication outpost in the heart of a frozen wilderness. It was supposed to be a quiet assignment, monitoring radio signals and ensuring that the base stayed operational. But what happened one night made me question everything I knew about my time in the military and the place we had been sent to watch over. When I first arrived, it seemed normal enough. The base was small, buried in snow and surrounded by nothing but barren, icy landscapes. We were cut off from the rest of the world except for radio transmissions, and most of the time the only thing we picked up was static. The isolation was hard to bear, but the routine helped, until we started hearing things on the radio that shouldn't have been there. At first it was faint, just strange bursts of static that we wrote off as interference. But soon, the pattern started changing, turning into something more organized, Morse code or something like it. It was Private Thompson who first noticed, tapping me on the shoulder one night as we sat in the control room. "You hear that?" he asked, voice low. I nodded, leaning closer to the speaker. It was faint but unmistakable. A repeating series of tones, almost like a distress signal. It was just past midnight when it happened again. The snowstorm outside had picked up, making visibility almost zero. We were both exhausted, running on little sleep and endless cups of coffee. But when the signal started coming through again, it snapped us to attention. This time it was clearer, stronger. It seemed to be coming from deep within the frozen wasteland, far beyond the perimeter of our base. Maybe it's one of the other outposts? I suggested, though I knew there was no one for miles. Thompson shook his head. All nearby posts have been accounted for. Whatever this is, it's not from anyone we know. We were making our rounds, checking the equipment and trying to trace the signal, when something caught my eye through the frosted window. A shadow, faint and distant, moving across the snow. I froze, watching it carefully. At first I thought it was just an animal or maybe a trick of the light, but it moved too deliberately, too slowly. "What is that?" I whispered, motioning to Thompson. He squinted into the blizzard, his face growing pale as he caught sight of it too. "That doesn't look like one of ours," he muttered. We both stood in silence, staring into the storm. The figure was getting closer, but still too far to make out any details. My heart was racing, a cold sweat forming on my back despite the freezing temperatures. The radio signal had grown louder, the strange tones pulsing through the speakers in rhythm with our racing thoughts. "Maybe we should check it out," I said, my voice sounding far more confident than I felt. Thompson shot me a glance, clearly uneasy, but nodded. We grabbed our gear, threw on our parkas, and stepped out into the howling wind. The cold hit us like a wall as soon as we left the base. The snow crunched underfoot, and the world was reduced to a swirling blur of white and shadow. But as we moved toward the figure, something changed. The air grew heavy, like we were wading through something more than just the storm. Every step felt harder, and the closer we got, the less sure I was that we should be doing this. Suddenly, the figure stopped moving. It stood motionless, its back turned to us, just on the edge of visibility. Thompson raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog of snowflakes, and that's when I saw it, what little I could see of it. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape was distorted, almost like it wasn't fully there. My heart pounded in my chest as the flashlight flickered, the figure's form seeming to shift and blur, like it was something not quite human. We stopped, barely 20 feet away. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and ragged, and Thompson's voice cracking as he whispered, "We need to go. Now." But before we could turn back, a sound split through the howling wind. It wasn't the storm, and it wasn't the radio. It was coming from the figure, a low, droning hum, almost like a deep, broken signal. It reverberated in the air, vibrating through my bones, making the ground beneath us feel like it was shaking. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure turned slowly, its face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood or helmet, but its eyes were dark, empty voids, staring right at us. Without warning, the radio on my belt crackled to life, spewing out a garbled transmission, the same tones we had been hearing. But now they sounded warped, as though being played backward. Thompson dropped his flashlight, his voice barely a whisper. "Run." We bolted. The snow whipped around us, the wind roaring in our ears, but all I could hear was that low hum following us, growing louder, closer. My legs felt like they were moving through water, my lungs burning as we raced back toward the base. I didn't dare look back, but I knew it was still behind us, closing in with every second. Thompson stumbled, falling to his knees, and I grabbed him, pulling him up as we reached the doors. We slammed them shut, collapsing inside, gasping for breath. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing and the storm raging outside. We never spoke about it after that night. There was no explanation, no logical reason for what we saw or heard. The signal stopped coming through the radio after that. We told the higher-ups it must have been atmospheric interference, but they didn't question it further. Word spread quickly, and soon, no one left the base at night anymore. Years later, after I'd left the military, I still thought about it. I never found out what we had stumbled upon in that frozen wasteland, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I could still hear the low hum, echoing in the back of my mind like a signal from a place no one should ever go. There are places in the world that exist beyond our understanding, places where something ancient lingers, waiting to be found. We are warned not to follow the strange signals in the void, not to seek out the unknown. And yet our curiosity pushes us toward the edge. But sometimes, it's better not to answer the call. Sometimes, the darkness is better left unexplored.